window now, so we'll have a record of this later. So we just finished talking about different ways that we can write multiplication. We can write it with the times symbol, but we don't really do that in high school anymore. We write things usually by writing them next to one another and using brackets or using a dot to separate them out. Of course, how we write division, same sort of idea. We could write, let's write some numbers that are easy for division. So let's say 6 divided by 2. That's easy for division. So we could write 6 divided by 2. And that's just going to be 3. So of course, the division symbol is not one that we have problems with it looking like an unknown, right? There's no letter that looks like the division symbol, so that's not as big of a problem. But usually we won't write things using the division symbol as much in high school. The farther you get in your math studies, the more we'll just use a line like this to indicate division. So we'll write it in its fraction format. So 6 divided by 2, that's also 3. Okay, so these are the ways we'll usually write division. Today we're going to see both, but we want to move more towards using the fraction way of writing it, because that's going to save us a little bit of space, and it's going to work better with more complicated stuff. Okay, so that's how we're going to write multiplication and division. We're getting away from that. Now here's the thing, we've got some multiplication here. And the question I want to ask is, does the order when we're multiplying, that we do the multiplying in, matter? Does it matter which order we do it in? Well, 2 times 3 is 6, and 3 times 2 is 6. You could think of it as 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2. Both of those work out to be 6. So it looks like when we've got two numbers, the order of multiplication doesn't matter. The only thing I would caution you about, though, is when we're writing with unknowns, we usually would not write, if we were writing, say, 5x again, that's one we used before, we would not write x5 like this. Usually in math, we want to write things with our coefficient, that's the number in front, first. So we'd write it like that, 5x would be the way we want to do it. Okay? They would mean the same thing, but there's kind of a convention for that. So the order doesn't really matter when we're talking about regular numbers. When we're writing it with unknowns, we want to follow the convention though. Okay, let's look though when we have 3 numbers, right? Does the order of multiplication matter for this? Can we just do it in any order? Let's try our different orders here. So it looks like I've got 2 times 3 times 4. Let's simplify this a little bit just by doing 2 times 3 first. So that's going to end up being 6 times 4. So I've done the 2 times 3, which equals 6. And now I'm going to do the final answer. 6 times 4 is 24. Let's try our next one. We're going to multiply the 4 and the 2 first as a first step. So 4 times 2 is 8 times 3. Well, 8 times 3 is also 24. What about our third one? 3 times 4 times 2. Let's do the 3 and the 4 first. So that's going to be 12 times 2. 12 times 2 is also 24. So it turns out the order of multiplication doesn't matter. When we're multiplying a whole bunch of things together, we can put them in any order we want. Doesn't matter. No problem. They're always going to give us the same answer. So if it's convenient for us to move the order around, that's great. I may want to move the order around so the biggest number is first because I find it easier to multiply bigger numbers earlier. So I might like the middle one. 4 times 2 is 8 times 3 is 24. Right? Maybe you like that better. Or maybe you like to end by multiplying by 2 because doubling is easy for you. So 3 times 4 is 12. Double that times 2 gives you 24. So any of these is equal. They all are the same thing. Okay, let's do a bunch of multiplying, but let's bring negative values into this. Okay, so using positive and negative values of multiplication and division is what we're looking at. I'm just going to start answering these things. I've got 3 times 5, 3 times 4, 3 times 3, 3 times 2, 3 times 1, 3 times 0. I'm just going to start writing them in. So 3 times 5, that's 15. 3 times 4, that's 12. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 0 is 0. Okay, so far so good. Really what we've done here is this one is 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3. And this one is 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3. You get the idea. 6 is just 3 plus 3. 2 groups of 3. This one is just 3, and this one is 0. So you can see the pattern that we've got going on here, right? I'm going to erase that just so it doesn't look like I'm multiplying by all those things. But you get the idea here that we have 5 threes, then 4 threes, then 3 threes, then 2 threes, then 1 3, then 0 threes, and finally we end up with negative 1 3. So 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. We've got negative 1 threes. Or you could think about it differently. You could think about it as 3 negative 1s. 3 negative 1s. Well, what about this next one? 3 times negative 2. You could think about this as 3 negative 2s. So negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, we know that's going to equal negative 6. Okay, we notice that when going up this way, I'm going from 0 to 3 to 6 to 9. And when going down this way, I'm going from 0 to negative 3 to negative 6 to negative 9. The pattern continues, except we're dealing with negatives at this point. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting rid of my lines here. So here's a little bit of thing to help you wrap your brain around what this actually means, right? So you've probably practiced this. You're probably okay with it. But what does this following actually mean? Negative 1 times 3. Well, it means I have 3 groups of negative 1, right? Negative 1 times 3 means I have 3 groups of negative 1. What about 8 times negative 2? What does that mean? Well, that means I have 8 groups of negative 2. And so 8 groups of negative 2, when you add all those together, you're going to end up with negative 16. So the trick we want to follow when we're multiplying or dividing integers is don't worry about the sign to start. Don't worry about the sign, whether it's positive or negative. Don't worry about the sign to start. Just look at how big the numbers are, do the multiplying and dividing, and then once you know the amount of the number, then it's much easier to figure out whether it's going to be positive or negative. And we'll try practicing that in a minute. Let's try another one here where we're starting with negative 2. So we'll go negative 2 times 5. I know the answer of 2 times 5 is 10. And since I've got one negative in there, it's going to be negative 10. I know that 2 times 4 is 8, so that'll be negative 8. I know that 2 times 3 is 6, so that'll be negative 6. 2 times 2 is 4, so that'll be negative 4. 2 times 1 is 2, so that'll be negative 2. 2 times 0 is just 0, because anything times 0 is 0. Now we're going the other direction. You see we were in negatives. Now we should end up in the positives. Negative 2 times negative 1 is 2. Our negatives actually cancel each other out. Our negative 2 and our negative 1, because they're both negative, the two negatives actually cancel each other out, and we've got a positive answer. Negative 2 times negative 2 is going to be positive 4. So again, our two negatives canceled each other out. We ended up with a positive number. So I imagine you're pretty used to that, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Now here's where it might get a little funny, is I've got negative 2 times 5. Right? Negative 2 times 5. Oh, okay, that's easy. That's negative 10. I know 2 times 5 is 10, and I know there's a negative in there, so it's going to be negative 10. What if we take all of that and we multiply it by negative 1? What if we take all that and we multiply it by negative 1? Well, that's actually going to change the sign and make it 10, because my two negatives will cancel out, and multiplying anything by 1 doesn't change the amount. How about my next one? I'm multiplying by 1 again, so that's not going to change the amount, but it's actually negative 1. So now I've got 3 negative numbers in there. 2 of them are going to cancel out. I've got 1 left over, so I'm still going to have a negative. So this one will be negative 10, and this one will be positive 10, and this one will be negative 10, and this one will be positive 10, and this one will be negative 10, and this one will be positive 10. So the key idea here is that if we've got an even number of negatives, they all cancel each other out, and we're left with a positive number. If we've got an odd number of negatives, like 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 negative numbers, they all cancel out except for one negative number that remains. and that negative value is going to make the whole thing negative when it's involved in our multiplication or our division. So how can we write that in just kind of like a short form here? So here's kind of the idea, and then I'm going to show this to you in graphical form so it's easier to remember. An odd number of negative signs in a multiplication or division problem leads to a negative answer. So an odd number, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So an odd number of negative signs in a multiplication or division problem leads to a negative answer. Of course, that also means that an even number of negative signs in a multiplication or division problem leads to a positive answer. So sometimes we don't even have to worry about the negative signs. We just count them up and see how many there are in one big multiplication or division problem. And we can just write down our answer, and we'll know whether it needs to be negative or positive based on how many negative signs are in there. So let's look at this in kind of like a graphical form. When we multiply two positives, multiply together, make positive. And the example would be 3 times 2 is 6. When we multiply two negatives together, we get a positive answer. Negative 3 times negative 2 equals positive 6. When we multiply a negative number times a positive number, like negative 3 times positive 2, we get a negative answer. And when we multiply a positive number by a negative number, we also get a negative answer. So how can we write that in kind of a short form? Now the rules for dividing, of course, are exactly the same. Take whatever you saw here, but think of dividing, exactly the same. So here's kind of our shortcut, right? Here are the rules we need to remember. This is really what we need to remember. Two like signs make a positive sign. Two unlike signs make a negative sign. Well, what does that mean? It's like this. Two positive numbers multiplying together give you a positive number. Two negative numbers multiplying together also give you a positive number. If we've got a positive and a negative, that's going to be a negative answer. If we've got a negative and a positive, that's going to be a negative answer. And that works for both multiplying and dividing. So let's try a few of those out just to put this into practice. Okay, here we go. Let's put a screen on this. When dividing positive and negative values, determine the sign of the final answer and then find the number answer. So it's easy if we split them apart, right? Let's do that. Here we got one. It's negative 20 divided by 4. So first let's just figure out what the sign will be. Looks to me like there's one negative in that multiplication or division problem. So that's an even number. So that means I'm going to end up with a negative answer. And now I can figure out what that answer is going to be. 20 divided by 4 is 5. So negative 5. How about this one? 35 divided by negative 7. Okay. Well, there's one negative in there. That's an odd number. So I know the answer is going to be negative because it doesn't get canceled out. 35 divided by 7 is also 5. Different question, also works out to negative 5. How about this one? We got negative 12 divided by negative 3. Now in this case, there are two negative values. They're going to cancel each other out when they divide. They're going to end up being positive. The answer will be positive. 12 divided by 3 is 4. And it's positive 4. So think about the sign first, then think about the division or multiplication operation. Now I want to warn you that sometimes things are written without brackets, like this one here, negative 12 divided by negative 3. It's still 4, the answer's still the same, but to me that's a little bit sloppy. It's like, it's hard to tell what's what, it would be easy to get mixed up, so throw brackets around things like that. That's going to make things a lot easier to manage, a lot easier to look at. Throwing brackets around that would be much preferable when you're writing your answers. Okay, last thing I want to try some of these. We've got some multiplication and division all grouped into one. This is one big multiplication and division problem for each of them, for A, B, and C. We're going to try A, B, and C. I'll keep using my purple marker, but let's make it a little thinner. I'm going to start with my first one. Let's throw a screen on there so we can kind of focus, one at a time. I'm going to start with my first one, and I'm just going to worry about what's on the numerator first, because I think it'd be too much to try and do it all at once. So let's just worry about what's on the numerator first. So I've got -4 times 6. I know that's going to end up being a negative value because it's a single negative in there. And 4 times 6 is, well, 2 times 6 is 12, so 4 times 6 has got to be 24. So I've got -24 divided by -8. Now a negative divided by a negative, there's 2 negatives in there when I do that operation. So that they're going to cancel out, and I'm going to end up with a positive value. So it'll be positive. What's 24 divided by 8? It's 3. 8 goes into 24 3 times. So all of that worked out to a positive answer. I could have known it was positive from the beginning by looking. I see, aha, there's a negative sign there, and aha, there's a negative sign there. So I know those two are eventually going to cancel each other out, and I know the answer is going to be positive. There is an even number of negative signs in there. How about my next one? For my next one, I'd like you to have a look at the number of negative signs in all those things that are being multiplied and divided. I'd like you in the chat right now to tell me if you think my final answer for this next one is going to be negative or if it's going to be positive. Based on our rules that we learned, is our final answer going to be negative or is it going to be positive? Go ahead and post in the chat right now what you're thinking. Matthew, I can see your post, but it looks like a degrees symbol or a 0. Aha, now it's gone. Okay, so post in the chat. Do you think it's going to be negative or do you think it's going to be positive? There's 3 negative signs involved in that operation. Is that going to be negative or is that going to be positive? Go ahead and post in the chat right now. What do you think? Oh, Matthew, when you type the sign there, it did that. That's interesting. I wonder why. There must be an autocorrect feature that's doing that. Weird. Some of you might be experiencing the same sort of thing. I guess what I should have done is had you all type it in and then not hit enter. That would have been a smarter way to do it. Yeah, it thinks you're starting a list. Okay, that's good to know, Matthew. Thanks for figuring that out. Thanks, Tyler Rose. Thanks, Nico. Next time what I'll do is I'll just have everyone type it in, but without hitting enter. That way we can all enter it all at once, right? And it'll be a big flood of answers. Okay, so let's do this. 5 times, so on the top, right? I know that those are 2 negatives, so they're going to cancel out and be positive on the top. 5 times 3 is 50. It'll probably be nicer if I put some brackets around that. Now we've got 15 divided by -10. I know my answer is going to end up being negative because we've got a negative number in there, but only a single one. 15 divided by 10, well, that's going to end up being a fraction, which we're going to study tomorrow. So if I put it in its lowest form, that's going to be 3/2. It's my simplest form of my fraction. I could divide them, and I could end up with -1.5. Right, if I actually divide it out and get a decimal number. So it was negative, yeah, because there was 3 negative signs in there. Oh, okay, have a look at this one. I'd like you to type in the chat. I'd like everybody to type in the chat. Is this a negative number or a positive number, our final answer for this? What's our final answer going to be? Count up the number of negative signs that you see in there, and then take your best guess. Don't hit enter, though. Just type it into the chat. So I'll ask you to just type it into the chat box, and I'll say when to press enter. So think about that right now. Will the final answer be negative or positive? I'll give you 20 seconds to type that into the chat box. Okay, go ahead and hit enter. Everybody hit enter right now, please. Thanks, folks. That worked much better. I got a nice big flood of responses all at once. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to count up the number of negative signs. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of them in there. There's 6 of those numbers that are negative. So is that an even or an odd number? 6 is an even number. So that means all the negative signs are going to cancel each other out, and we're going to end up with a positive answer. So I know you should be expecting a positive answer. You can kind of think about it like this. This negative sign and this negative sign will cancel out and be positive. This negative sign and this negative sign will cancel out and be positive. This negative sign and this negative sign will cancel out and be positive. So they all kind of pair up and cancel out like that. Okay, so let's see if I can do this in steps here. My first step, I've got, I know in the top there's 4 negatives, so my answer is going to be positive. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 4 is going to be 24. Now on the denominator on the bottom, the 2 negative numbers, when they multiply, the negatives will cancel out. Negative times a negative is a positive, and 3 times 2 is 6. Now I've got a positive number divided by a positive number. That's going to give me a positive answer. 24 divided by 6 is 4. Okay. So that's the key idea here. Our big takeaway from this is the goal is to not make problems with negative and positive, not make mistakes with negative and positive signs as often as possible. When you think about this, if you were to design something that involved math, like the classic example is building a bridge, right? Engineer builds a bridge, and you put a negative sign in the wrong place, you can design something that's going to explode or fall apart or actually be actively harmful to people. If you're making financial predictions for your small business and you get a negative sign in the wrong place, you can get into big trouble financially by making a big mistake, right? So actually making sure we don't make those little mistakes is an important skill that we're going to work on. Okay, so I'm going to end the lesson part here.